Okay, hi everybody. Thank you for coming to my talk. My name is Brent. A little bit of background about myself. I studied music performance in college. I have a degree in classical music performance, which raises the question, what am I doing here? But after doing music performance for a little while, I moved abroad to teach English, so I've got a background in practicing music, really. That's what music performance degrees are like. It's just practicing. And also a little bit of experience in education. So I'm going to dissect the title of my presentation for you. Beginner Linux for the Autodidact. Firstly, let's see. Here we go. What is an autodidact? An autodidact is simply a self-taught person. But actually, when I think of the word autodidact, the connotation is kind of like a genius. I think of autodidacts as geniuses. This might be an availability thing because when you read about the word autodidact and you read about these people, you necessarily get examples of famous people who have made significant contributions to their field. So if you're the kind of person that comes to a Linux conference, you probably don't need introduction to Tesla, but Tesla didn't have formal education. The Wright brothers, Michael Faraday, these are all examples of autodidacts. So for this reason, I don't really consider myself an autodidact. I'm definitely not on that level. I'm a person that likes to learn things. And also, learning things are a lot easier now for me because I've got the internet. So it's much easier for me than it was for these people. Nextly, as for the word beginner, I don't think this presentation is necessarily just for people who installed Linux earlier this month. Anybody who wants to improve, and also experienced users looking to engage with beginners. I do want to talk about kind of like a gap in communication between people who are so experienced and so good at this that they don't really know how hard it is for the people who are stepping into this realm for the first time. And also, a lot of this stuff that I'm going to talk about today, it's not really just Linux specific. I want to talk about how to accumulate skill. A lot of the information that I've found, a lot of the research literature on this stuff, is not about Linux at all. There's a lot of research about how to accumulate skill in sports because those outcomes are very easy to measure. There's a lot of learning methods when it comes to studying music or languages, as in foreign languages. So I've looked into some research on all of these things, kind of cherry-picked the ones that work well that we can fit to Linux. And we're going to talk about these ideas, and most importantly, in my opinion, how to practice Linux deliberately. So with that being said, I've got to confess to you, the presentation title, Beginner Linux for the Autodidact, it's not completely true. It's just a really nice sounding presentation to get you come to this conference hall. It's not really just for beginners. It's not only about Linux. I'm not an autodidact, so the honest presentation title today is How to Teach Yourself Stuff from a guy that's questionably qualified. So a quick outline, like what is autodidacticism? Why is it important? How can we be more effective as self-directed learners? I want to talk about tackling Linux and specifically why this can be a really unique challenge for beginners. And the major point here is the abstract before the technical. So basically understanding what it is you're trying to do before you learn how to do it. And we'll go into detail about that. Gathering learning resources. So a lot of the learning resources that I'm going to talk about are obvious, like reading books, of course. But I kind of want to talk about putting it in a Linux context, vetting materials that work well for you. Joining a community. If you're at Linux Fest, you're already doing a great job at joining a community. But I want to talk about online communities as well. And finally, what I said before, what I think the most important thing is, which would be how to practice. So Who's self-taught? Who is self-taught? Okay. Pretty much everybody here. I was going to say the 2016 Stack Overflow survey said about 69% of people, but a quick show of hands, it looks more than 69% in this room at least. So about 69% of people that responded to the Stack Overflow survey said they were self-taught. About 44% said they received on-the-job training. And I think this reflects something really important in computer science. Like, the tech world moves really quickly, so we have to learn quickly. This is going to help make you flexible and competitive. Also, nobody knows everything. So even if you're already really experienced, if you know a lot about Linux or whatever it is, that you're an expert in your field, being able to acquire knowledge quickly is going to help you always. So there's always going to be another tool out there that if only you knew how to use it, you'd be more effective at whatever it is you're trying to do. So when I was designing this presentation, I was thinking of like, what's a good thesis? How can I convince people that like this is an important topic? And this was the hardest slide for me to make because it is a thesis. I do think it's a good point and I will support it, but honestly, like, learning stuff is really cool and it just seems self-evident, and I think everybody feels that way about stuff. So everybody's found themselves like at 2 o'clock in the morning on a really random Wikipedia article like, oh my gosh, I have to go to bed, but I can't stop reading. We've all been there. But it doesn't make for a very good thesis. So actually, in my heart, my real point is, learning stuff is cool. Linux is cool. Let's learn Linux. So on the topic of how to learn, I don't want to be cliche, but I'm going to be incredibly cliche. We have to learn how to learn. So this study from Nate Cornell, a cognitive psychologist, called Failing to Predict Future Changes in Memory. This is a really interesting example about how if you don't really know, if you don't stop to think about your learning techniques, you could be really, really wrong. Cornell says people often have a faulty mental model of how they learn and remember. So this study in 2011, they took participants, they gave them some study material, they asked them what their judgment of learning was, which is basically asking, how hard do you think this will be to learn? And then they tested them on the material, they compared. How hard did they say it would be? How hard was it actually? And what the results of the test showed was that words presented in larger fonts were incorrectly judged to be more memorable. Now this is so fascinating because I don't think it was the case that the participants got the study materials and they were like, oh yeah, this font's huge. This is going to be a breeze. This is the sort of thing that you don't know, that you're making this weird, strange human brain mistake about the way that you're thinking. And these things happen all the time. So what are some study techniques that we know work that we can apply to Linux? Recall is better than rereading. Nate Cornell, one of the psychologists on the last studies, was a part of this study as well. And recall is better than rereading. This is common in the language learning community. People like to use flashcards to memorize stuff better, more quickly. This is from an article called Self-Regulated Learning, Beliefs, Techniques, and Illusions. So if you reread something, it gives the false impression of understanding. Let's say you're working at your computer, you try to remember the command that you want to type into the command line, you open your book, you skim through, you say, oh yeah, that's it, I remember that. But it's not really recalling something, it's more like being reminded of it, which is, it's not the same thing, being reminded of the information. And this is one of the beautiful points. Making errors is essential to the learning process. So this is actually a really good thing. If you're trying to remember how to work through a command, stop, work it out of your memory for a second, and even if you get it wrong and then immediately correct yourself, this is going to enhance long-term retention. This is going to be better for you to learn more quickly. So Barbara Oakley is a professor of engineering at Oakland University, and she's really big on the learning how to learn scene. And she's got a couple of books on this subject. I read A Mind for Numbers, and one of the topics that she talks about is guided reading. Guided reading is more effective. So the basic point of guided reading is when you get to a chapter in a textbook or something, don't read straight through it. First, go through the headers, read for new vocab words that you don't recognize, check out the pictures, get to the end, and if there's a summary at the end of the chapter, read through the summary, and then go through the chapter. And what this is going to do for you is it's going to help kind of create a mental model of the topic that you're learning right now. You're not going to be feeling around in the dark. You're not going to be asking yourself questions that are about to be answered on the next page. And kind of my own personal philosophy on this is that a lot of textbooks that you can learn from, they really read like a reference, and that's not always very useful. And also, it's really the author's opinion of the best way to tackle this material, but that might not be the best method for you, so don't feel like you're signing a contract with the author that you have to go through this in the order that they wrote it. Really, your goal is to get the useful information out of it, and if you need to skim back and forth throughout the chapter and flip through it, whatever method works best for you, tackle it in a guided way, and don't waste your time going page for page. So some of these things are about memorizing, but this is a really important point. Understanding and memorizing, of course, these are two different things. They work well together, and our goal here is to understand Linux. Now, I will assert that using memorization techniques can help assist that. And I think if you use memorization techniques effectively, you can learn pretty quickly. But our goal now, our method, will be to take the information, hold it in memory until we can create a good understanding of it, and then it's effortless. So this comes from Effective Learning, 20 Rules of Formulating Knowledge. This is from Piotr Wozniak, a memory researcher. He says, "Do not learn if you do not understand." And that kind of sounds like a bad translation. Like, how do we make meaning out of that? But it's a really good point. If the resource you're learning from says, this is how you partition a hard drive, and you don't know what a partition is, you have to stop. Don't learn how to partition a hard drive. Start asking questions like, what is a partition? Why do I need this? But if you waste your time memorizing the command for partitioning a hard drive, it's going to be useless to you if you don't know how or when or why you ought to be using it. This is a really interesting point. Learners don't understand episodic versus semantic memory. And when I read this, I was like, yes, that is so true. I have no idea what that means. But I researched it, and it's a very useful way of dividing the things that you're thinking about. Basically, don't memorize a bunch of trivia. Instead, you have to relate things to personal experiences or information that you're already really familiar with. So this is from Endel Tolving, a cognitive psychologist. In the article, Episodic and Semantic Memory, he talks about an episodic memory. His example is meeting a retired sea captain. An example of a semantic memory would be the chemical formula for salt. So to me, one of these is much more interesting, and one of them is much more memorable. So I have a personal anecdote with episodic memories. when I first started learning Linux, I was flipping through textbooks and reading stuff online, and one of the topics that kept coming up was cron. And cron works a little bit differently from regular commands. It's not the normal syntax that I had been seeing. And it kept coming up like cron or cron job, cron tab, and you use it to make a daemon or a daemon. And it was this sort of mystic thing to me. I wasn't sure what it was, but man, it sounded so cool, and it sounded so powerful. And I was thinking, if only I could master cron, then I'd really have it. Then I wouldn't be a beginner anymore. I'd really be a Linux guy if I knew what this meant. But I was intimidated by it, and I couldn't figure it out. And at about the same time, I was reading the book Snow Crash by Neil Stephenson. So Snow Crash, if you haven't read it, it's a cyberpunk sci-fi. It was written in the early 1990s, and it's just the perfect mix of early 1990s cyberpunk. It's set in this sort of metaverse, like a virtual reality, like The Matrix or Ready Player One's The Ocean. And it's, the main character, our hero, his name is Hero. He's got 2 samurai swords on his back, and he goes around fighting organized crime. So there was this scene in Snow Crash set inside the metaverse, which is this virtual reality place, inside the Black Sun, which is this seedy Tokyo-esque bar filled with organized crime and gangsters. So I'll read this passage from the chapter where they talk about the daemons of this virtual reality. So a daemon is an old piece of jargon from the Unix operating system, where it referred to a piece of low-level utility software, a fundamental part of the operating system. In the Black Sun, a daemon is like an avatar, but it does not represent a human being. It's a robot that lives in the metaverse, a piece of software, a kind of spirit that inhabits the machine, usually with some particular role to carry out. The Black Sun has a number of daemons that serve imaginary drinks to the patrons and run little errands for people. This is a really good example of an episodic memory. This was incredibly memorable to me, and when I read this, I wasn't reading this for any Linux-related purpose. It's just a nerdy sci-fi book. But when I read it, it clicked. I was like, oh, daemons. Cron is just a little robot. I looked at my computer and I was like, there are little robots walking around in there, serving drinks or doing whatever I tell them to do, just kind of monitoring the things. And the daemons are a reoccurring character that come up and help keep the Black Sun, the bar, clean and kick out unworthy patrons and stuff like that, and kind of making this into a character, into this sort of memory, this memorable experience. Everything made sense to me now. It clicked. So our goal, how do we take these learning techniques that we were talking about and make episodic memories out of them? And this is really common with memory champions. There's a really interesting book called Moonwalking with Einstein by Joshua Foer, and he started doing investigative journalism into the United States memory champions, and somebody there inspired him. They said, you could do it too. The very next year, he won the memory championship. He writes about the techniques, and it's really interesting. They take abstract, kind of almost absurd imagery, and they tie it to the thing that they're trying to learn. You make a mnemonic out of it, and then it's so memorable that you're not going to forget it. And it creates something that's abstract and turns it into a personal experience. So our goal now, we're not going to get as crazy as writing a sci-fi book for it, but we want to create memorable experiences using Linux. Okay. So what makes Linux so difficult? I think one of the first things that makes Linux really difficult for beginners is the jargon. Jargon means like a technical word unique to a subject. And anybody who steps their foot into the Linux store for the first time is going to be bombarded with words that they've never heard before. Now, for me, I'm not a big fan of the word jargon because I think of, like, in TV shows, when there's that one character that's always asking questions, like they don't understand anything, and they ask really obvious questions so that somebody can explain it in a dumbed-down way so the general audience watching at home can understand. And they always say things like, wait a minute, say that in English, please. This is the character I think of when I hear the word jargon. So I have a better word for it, a word that I like more. Arcana. Specialized knowledge that is mysterious to the uninitiated. And if you're uninitiated on this particular subject, I totally stole that from Dungeons and Dragons. So Linux is filled with arcana. When I told my family and friends that I'd be speaking at a Linux conference, they were really excited for me. They're like, that's great, that's so cool. What's Linux? And I was like, okay, well, it's an operating system. They're like, yeah? Like, well, it's technically it's a kernel, but it's GNU in Linux makes the operating system, and it's good for servers, but I use it for programming. And they're like, whoa, 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 say that in English, please. Like, okay, so how can we demystify the arcana? So one of the hard things about Linux is once you start, the learning curve feels like a vertical wall. It just feels like it's straight up. So you get into the terminal, you start typing some commands. The first 10 commands you learn are always basic navigation. It's really boring. You're moving from one directory to the next. You make some files, make some directories, delete them, and you're like, wow, this is way easier in Windows. Why am I doing this? This list is so boring, I didn't even finish the list. I just started to make it. I was like, they get the point. It's not that exciting. Arcana makes it really difficult to understand. So anything on this list right here, I'll use shell, bash, and terminal, for example. When you're learning Linux, these words seem to pop up interchangeably. And people insist that there's an important difference between a shell, a bash, and a terminal, but I can't figure out what it is. And pretty much anything on this list, it's got a counterpart. Should I use touch or cat to open a file? And these things, there are nuanced differences, but I'm not even sure what questions I should be asking to get to whatever the nuanced difference is. Am I going to break something if I use touch instead of cat to create a file? So commands that you don't understand, they seem arbitrary. So if you go to askubuntu.com and sort by the most voted question, the highest question on the list is how to list all installed packages. And full disclaimer, I cherry-picked the really complicated-looking ones. It's not that hard. You can just type apt list installed. But all of these commands, allegedly, they'll get you the same thing. And if you're a beginner, all of that seems like nonsense. It seems like you could type just about anything in there and you get a different output. There's no way to decode this for the uninitiated. So another top question from Ask Ubuntu. What's the difference between apt and apt-get? And this was a really upvoted question, and I remember asking myself this question when I started learning Linux. I'm working my way through different commands that I find in different places, and sometimes I type sudo apt, sometimes I type sudo apt-get, and why am I doing one or the other? So that's the most upvoted answer, the one that the community agrees on, I've copied and pasted here. It's this long list of things. This is a little dense for a beginner. So I have an analogy that I would like to make, okay? Imagine that you're a photographer, an expert photographer. You know everything there is to know about photography, and somebody asks you, what's the difference between these two photos? You would probably say something, you'd be really excited to talk about your craft. And you'd say something like, well, the lighting, or the composition, or maybe the aperture. And I don't really know what aperture means. I just know that it's a camera word. So if you're a camera pro and I've embarrassed myself, tell me quietly after the presentation, please, okay? But you get really into the technical details. But for the beginner, I would like to point out that if you look closely, one of these pictures is a horse and the other one's a zebra. And sometimes, that's all I'm really asking. That's what I really wanted to know. I don't need the long technical explanation. I just want to know, why am I using apt and why am I using apt-get? So for the beginner, as far as the beginner is concerned, it's pretty much the same thing. One of them is just like the 2.0, a skin over top of the other, if you will. But it's really hard to get to this answer when the entire community is lifting up the really nuanced, complex answer for experts. So it's not a problem, it's just difficult for the uninitiated. So we've got all of these problems. Being stuck in beginner land is really boring. It's really hard to decipher some of the commands. What am I doing and why am I doing it? Everything looks really dense. I don't know the difference between distros. Eventually, if you're working from a desktop, you're going to find out, oh yeah, wait a minute, this wasn't built for desktops, this was built for servers, and that's why I have to worry about commands like who, or who is on my computer. It's really hard to untangle all of this stuff, and you're not even sure what questions to ask sometimes. So, here are the questions you should ask. What am I doing? Why am I doing this? What does this command do? And when I ask that question, what I really mean is, what is the syntax? How does the syntax work? Do I really need to understand all of this before I keep moving forward? And maybe the most important question is, am I going to break something? So I want to do a case study on permissions. Because if you're coming from Windows, permissions are just that annoying thing that pop up every time you try to install something. And you don't even really know why it pops up. And I'm the only one that uses the computer. I am the admin. Why do I have to keep getting permission for anything that I want to install? So every beginner book for Linux has got something to do with permissions. It keeps coming up. It must be important. So let's use this as our case study for the questions to ask for a beginner. So I remember the first time I saw permissions, I had no idea what chmod meant, and I called it chmod. And I didn't know much about read, write, execute. And I had no idea what 664 stood for. This is a strange command for the uninitiated. So the first question is, what am I doing? As in, what am I actually trying to accomplish? Trying to understand it in the abstract. We're going to change the permissions so that we can limit which users and programs can have access to which files. Okay, that's good enough. Why do I want to do that? So, why am I doing this? In the case of permissions, a little bit of research online, maybe a couple of textbooks you open up to the permissions chapter, and they say, well, a lot of programs can affect your system in unexpected ways, so permissions are kind of up there as a safeguard to keep things from happening in unexpected ways, and this is especially important if you're a beginner. So it can mitigate the unexpected. That's a good enough answer for now. I think I can move on. What does this command do? And this part feels really good because you start to demystify it a little bit. Chmod, as it turns out, stands for change mode. And this was also another light bulb moment. I was like, well, that's way less arbitrary. That makes sense. Because before I knew that, before I knew mode was another word for permissions, I couldn't imagine what chmod had to do with the concept of permissions. So now that we know what we're going to do and why we're going to do it, we can start to tackle these questions. Change mode, 664 foo.txt. Foo.txt being the file that we're going to change the permissions on. But what is 664? So 664 is a clever system for assigning permissions, like which permission goes to which user or group. And maybe that's an overly concise explanation for the fledgling arcanist, but the next point that I'm going to make excuses me from a full explanation, and I don't think anybody wants to listen to a full explanation right now anyways. That's not really the scope of the talk. Do I need to understand this fully in order to keep moving? You can learn rapidly if you're willing to accept that understanding will come with time. So if you're not willing to turn the page until you've mastered everything on the current page and you fully understand it, you're going to be stuck navigating directories and copying files, and that's about it for a really long time. So I take a mental note. I say, okay, change mode, 664, some other numbers sometimes. And that helps me know which person's going to get which permission, but I'm not going to remember any of that stuff. I'm just going to remember what page in my book it's on and just try to remember that it's a thing. But the last question that you have to ask yourself, a very important question, is, if I do this wrong, will I break my machine? So if you're going to keep moving forward with a fuzzy understanding of how things work, a fuzzy understanding that you know will clear up with time, it's important to do a little bit of research on the topic that you're tackling. And in the case of permissions, it seems that everybody online, everybody on Stack Overflow and Ask Ubuntu, they all say change mode 777 is for noobs. It's bad, don't do it. And I don't even have to know why. I just have to know, oh man, I don't want to be a noob. I'm not going to do that. So at least for now, that's going to keep me safe. It's going to keep me from breaking my machine. And that's enough to move forward. So with our move quick and try not to break things too badly philosophy, we've taken kind of a pretty serious topic for beginners, something that comes up in every beginner textbook. And we've condensed it to 5 points, and this is enough. This is enough to move forward. I've learned that permissions are a thing. Everyone online says they're important. The syntax is kind of like you see 4s, 6s, and 7s, like the number 5 in there. It's a clever system. I don't have to get it yet. It's okay. I get it enough to move forward. And I don't think I need change mode right now, but I get the main point, and just in super important mental note, don't use change mode 777. Otherwise I'm a noob. This is enough to hold on to until you get the chance to make a memorable episode. So imagine the beginner working their way through this. They get enough of an understanding. Next thing you want to learn is how to make a shell script or something like that. And you type out your script, you want to run it, you try to execute it, it doesn't work. So you go online to Stack Exchange, and you say, why won't my script execute? And somebody says, well, you need to change the permissions. You need to change the mode. You're like, oh, that's what that's for. And suddenly it clicks. So if you were still sticking around in the permissions chapter of your textbook, you would never have had the opportunity to actually use permissions in a real meaningful way to create an episodic memory. So getting enough to move forward and then moving on is going to increase everything you've got in your toolkit, and that's what Linux is all about. There are all of these tools that work together. On the subject of learning resources, the first most important learning resource that we learn about are the man pages. And You're going to have to get comfortable using them, obviously. It is important, but in my opinion, it's a really hard place to learn from. So it kind of feels like information overload. And commands aren't really organized into most useful or common idioms that everybody else seems to know. It's organized alphabetically, and it's really hard to piece that stuff together. So as a learning resource, I recommend referencing it. And don't feel discouraged if you're a beginner. If you are one of the people who installed Linux earlier this month, and every YouTube video you watch for beginners say like, oh, you've got to learn how to use the man pages. Like it's hard at first, and that's okay. Don't beat yourself up over it. You'll get the hang of it. Understanding will come with time. So I would feel pretty stupid if I got up here and like exclaimed like, guys, you can learn anything on YouTube. It's amazing. But YouTube is a serious resource for learning, especially for self-taught people, but it can be really tricky because there's a lot of really bad YouTube videos out there. I don't want to sit through a 15-minute video that has a clickbaity title like 10 commands everybody needs to know, and like the first one is like ls. I could get 10 commands everybody needs to know from a clickbaity article, and all the time it would take me is however long it takes for all the ads and pop-ups to load. So as far as YouTube channels go, I can recommend Hacktip. They've got a series called Linux Terminal 101. So if you are like the beginner level that I'm talking about right now, I think this channel does a really good job of adhering to some of the techniques, kind of understanding what's going on before teaching you a bunch of commands, which is one of the most important parts of creating an understanding of your workspace. Another level up from that, the Linux man, this is probably better for people that are in like sysadmin or servers or mainframes or something like that. It's a level up, but it's all consistently reliable information. I'm a huge fan of books and learning from books. So if books work well for you, I recommend getting on github.com. There's a GitHub called eBook Foundation that's just full of free books that you can get your hands on pretty much every subject in computer science. It's full of really good information. If you don't know what Humble Bundle is, humblebundle.com is a website where you can buy, I guess, software packages. Really, when it first came onto the scene, people were really raving about getting a bunch of games off of it, but they've really moved in the direction of book packages as well. And back in July, they had a No Starch Press Linux Humble Bundle, and I grabbed that really quick, and it had a lot of really good books in it. So I think they've got 2 bundles up right now that are programming related. I don't know if a lot of people here are programming, but there's a Head First series that's available on Humble Bundle right now that's really good introductory level things. And there's also like a Maker's Raspberry Pi book kit. But I recommend keeping your eyes on Humble Bundle. And I really like pretty much everything that I've read from No Starch Press. You kind of get from the title what level it's at. You know, if it says beginner Linux on it, it's going to be really good for you. And if some of the book titles might be a little bit more advanced, but skim through them, and it's really easy to digest the information that they've got there. So finding a community, really any place online where people are talking about this stuff. My thought process on this is if you want to learn a second language, it's recommended, like in an ideal world, you can go to a country, move to a country where that target language is being spoken. But the cool thing about Linux is the target language is spoken online, and if you're on your computer, you're online, you're there. As soon as you start using Linux, you're in the home country of Linux. So I think everybody knows how to find online communities where you're communicating with people, message boards where you can chat. I don't need to say, like, oh, guys, you can talk to people on Reddit about whatever. Like, we all already know that. But my real point is it's an important thing to do. So Hacker News is not a website about Linux at all, but the level of discussion happening there, it's a bunch of people who are literate on the subject, and it happens fluently. And you start to get an impression of these things, and even if you don't really know what's going on, just getting an impression can help it be a little bit less mystified when you get to that subject later. So I really recommend making an intentional effort to just start digesting some communities online where the discussion in computer science is happening. So Stack Exchange, obviously, this is kind of a learning resource and a community, and I'm a programmer, and I have Stack Exchange open on one window at all times at my workplace. And there's limitless, really good information, and it's vetted by the community. So you can hear discussion, both endpoints. I did have some examples up today about how intimidating the discussion on Stack Exchange can be. But there's a lot of really good beginner stuff there too. So just finding the materials and feeling confident in approaching them is an important step to the learning process. So how to stay in shape. Command line cardio. This is an idea that I got from Brad Traversy, who does web development videos. He's got a YouTube channel, and he sells them on, I think, Coursera or something like that. But he had a video called JavaScript Cardio, and he just went into the console and started just working in JavaScript. He wasn't writing code. He was just practicing being good at writing code. And my background is in classical music performance, and really something clicked with me at this point. It's not really about having written nice code. The goal is to be good at writing it. So working really hard and writing a whole bunch of stuff once and getting it perfect, where you've got a shaky understanding of all of this stuff, that's not really what we're looking for here. We want to find a way that we can actually practice it. And this is really good. Anytime you've got a command line in front of you, you can practice. So we want to practice every day. Whenever I get to my computer or my workstation, I run through a couple of commands that I keep on a notepad next to me. Make it the first thing that you do. And no command is too trivial. A musician would never say, oh man, I'm so tired of practicing the C major scale. You can always be better at something. You can always be more efficient. So even if you write on your practice cardio script, your to-do list for your cardio, make an alias in bash alias script. That's a useful thing to do. If you're working in a new virtual environment and you want to change your aliases real quick, if you can just slap that on the keyboard and switch it around really quick, you're gonna look like an arcanist. You're gonna feel way more confident. And getting some of these more trivial things out of the way, it's only going to help you tackle the next step. So this is an important thing on any level. So I wanted to show you my notes that I put online on the subject of Arcana. Sorry. I lost internet though. Okay, I think we're back. So if you go to my website, which was not designed for 4:3 aspect ratio, bbenz.io, if you scroll down to the bottom, there's Linux command line cardio button here. And this is nothing fancy. This is just my notes that I've tossed online. This is an example of the way that I've managed to find a practice routine. How can I get better at Linux? How can I spend deliberate time improving my Linux skills? So I've tried to decipher my notes to be a little bit more friendly to those who want to skim through it, but really what I recommend is doing this on your own. When you're learning through these resources and you learn glob, take a couple of notes about what it is and some of the syntax, how to use it, and then come up with exercises for yourself. or even copy exercises out of the book. So every day I go through this same script. The ones that I'm using now are a little bit more advanced than this, but I keep this same to-do list where I set some of these goals for myself. And what's happening is it's really the same thing as when you're practicing music. You start off with just a scale, and it's the same scale every day. And when you start to get more confident in it, you start to explore the limitations of this scale. So input-output is a good example. You know, how to redirect something into a file. I started with only and strictly what was here, and I didn't understand it very well, but I knew that it would come with time. And then I started to experiment with it, and I was like, I've seen some other ways that I can use these commands. Let me try and test the boundaries of this a little bit. And after time, using only this same little to-do list that I've made for myself, I gained confidence and understanding. When I'm actually working later that day and I say, oh man, I really want to pipe something into less, which, sorry, I know that's arcana if you're actually a very early beginner, but having these tools at your fingertips and having done them earlier that day will help you find uses for them in your workflow later that day. So this is just a simple example, but it's kind of like, I recommend checking this out and then making your own, because this is how you're going to improve quickly. With that being said, I've got a references page for some of the studies that I've looked at and talked about here today. And I would like to thank everybody for coming to see my presentation. So, thank you.